Have you ever just sat there and wondered how your company actually decides what to pay you? It can feel like this big, unsolvable mystery, right? Well, today we are pulling back the curtain on what's called the corporate pay blueprint. Let's dive in. I mean, it's the question we all have. Is your salary just based on your last job or how well you negotiated? Maybe it just depends on the hiring manager's mood that day. Well, for most big companies, the answer is way more structured than you'd probably think. That's right. It's not some secret, confusing algorithm or a random number they just pull out of thin air. There's a real method to it, a framework, a blueprint, and we're going to walk through exactly how it's built step by step. So here's the game plan. First, we'll demystify the whole process. Then, we'll look at how companies actually build this blueprint from the ground up. After that, we'll see how they add all the details, where your performance fits into the picture. And finally, we'll talk about the times when the system has to bend a little. Okay, so let's get into our first section, this salary mystery. The main goal for any company's compensation team is to create a system that feels fair on the inside, but is also competitive on the outside. And the way they do that is by using something called a pay structure. So what does that actually mean? Well, a pay structure really does two key things. First, it sets up why jobs of unequal value are paid differently. Why a senior engineer makes more than an entry-level coordinator. And second, it creates the rules for recognizing your specific contributions, like your performance and your experience. So how in the world is this blueprint actually built? In Section 2, we're going to break down the 5 main steps companies use to create their entire compensation system, basically from scratch. It all starts with them deciding how many different pay structures they even need. From there, they dive into market research to draw something called a pay line. Then they use that line to define pay grades and figure out the salary ranges for each grade. The last step, they just step back and evaluate the whole thing to make sure it's working fairly. Step 1 is actually pretty straightforward. A company might, for example, create one pay structure for all its salaried managers, the ones who are exempt from overtime, and a totally separate one for its hourly, non-exempt employees. They might even have different structures for tech roles versus, say, sales roles. Now, let's talk about step 2 because this is really the foundation of the entire blueprint. Companies use tons of salary data to plot out what you see here, a market pay line. Now, on the bottom axis, you see job evaluation points. That's just a fancy way of saying a score a company gives a job based on how complex it is. And as you can see, jobs with more points, jobs with more value, they line up with higher salaries out there in the market. But a single line isn't really enough to manage pay for a whole company. So in Section 3, we're going to see how they add some much-needed layers of detail, turning that simple line into a system of grades and ranges that they can actually use. Okay, so check this out. This is the next logical step. Instead of trying to manage hundreds of individual pay points for every single job title, companies group jobs of similar value into these broader pay grades. So a receptionist, a clerk, and a messenger, they might all land in the exact same grade because the company views their overall value as pretty comparable. And this brings us to the final piece of the blueprint, pay ranges. Each one of those grades we just looked at gets its own range built right around that market pay line. You've got a minimum for folks who are new to the role, a maximum for the real experts, and a midpoint that's tied directly to that market data. This gives managers the flexibility to pay people differently even if they're in the same grade, all based on their individual skills. Okay, so the company has its structure. That's great for them. But how do they decide where you fit inside your range? And more importantly, how do you move up? That's what we're going to cover in Section 4, paying for your performance. For most salaried professionals, raises aren't just handed out randomly. Nope, they are tied to a system that's designed to reward your contributions. This is called a merit pay system, and it creates a direct link between your performance review and your paycheck. And this is the tool that makes it all happen, the merit pay grid. Now, I know it looks a little complex, but it's actually super simple. Your manager just finds your performance rating along the top, let's say you had an excellent year, and then they find your current spot in the pay range on the side. Where those 2 points meet, that's your recommended raise. Just notice how a top performer who's low in their range gets a much bigger raise. And that's really the whole idea right there. The system is designed to get strong performers up toward that market midpoint, and to do it quickly. On the flip side, if you're already paid at the very top of your range, even an excellent review will get you a smaller percentage raise. It's all about rewarding your growth into a role. Of course, no system is perfect, right? The real world gets messy. So in our last section here, we're going to look at some of the common exceptions and pressures that can make this nice, neat blueprint have to bend a little bit. First up, let's talk about a really common headache: pay compression. This is what happens when the job market for new talent gets super hot and companies have to start making offers to new hires that are, well, uncomfortably close to what their experienced long-term employees are already making. To put it really plainly, it's that incredibly frustrating moment when you, a veteran employee, realize what's happening. It's when companies have to pay a premium to bring in new people, but they forget to adjust the salaries of their existing staff to keep things fair. And let me tell you, it can be a huge morale killer. And finally, there are two other exceptions you'll hear about. A green circle rate just means someone is being paid below the minimum for their job's pay range. Maybe they're still in training or something. The exact opposite is a red circle rate. That's when an employee is being paid above the maximum, which often happens when a company really wants to keep a star performer who isn't quite ready for a promotion. So after all that, what should you take away? Well, first, just remember that your salary isn't some random number. It's part of a bigger blueprint that's built on real market data. Second, this system groups jobs into grades, and every one of those grades has a clear pay range. And most importantly, your performance is what determines your growth inside that range. It's a system with its own logic, and now you know how to read it. Understanding all this really empowers you. You can now see the logic, the levers, and even the language of corporate pay. So the final question is really for you. Now that you know the blueprint, does your own pay make a little more sense?